what do we mean by Teshuva? Or put it another way, what kind of change are we talking about when we talk about Teshuva? Let me try and explain what I mean. See, I think that in many ways, we look at someone adopting more halachic practice or whatever, what you're seeing is not a real transformation of the person. What you're seeing is that the person is basically adopting certain behaviors that really expresses what they're doing. Okay? Okay. Let me try and explain what I mean by that. There's a whole thing in psychology about they point out how certain people have really changed, they say, and the whole argument about how certain people have changed or whatever, and in that argument they say, look, this person was a big commie, now he's a big right-winger, right? I'm just giving an example, whatever, but or I don't want to be derogatory, commie or whatever. I'm just trying to say that people look at this and say, person used to be really into this and now he's into that. But in psychology, if they point out that really, if you look at the person's behavior, it's really very similar. Beforehand he was fanatic about this, and now he's fanatic about that. And what I often find with a lot of movements of individual is that we talk about changes in people, we talk about people who are more observant, less observant, or actually more observant. What we find is really a change in behavior. But at its root, is there a change in essence? Well, obviously there can't be a full change of essence because everyone's the same. You know, obviously, if you're a type of person, then you're the same type of person. But the real question is especially now at this time, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and you're talking about Teshuva, what exactly is Teshuva? What are we really talking about in terms of Teshuva? Okay? And, hey Cheryl, is it just a change in behavior? Or is there something more fundamental that's changing? And then you have to look to see what you're defining by that. So what I find is that we generally talk as if we're happy and we're content with a change in behavior. But what I find is that we look at change in behavior, we really don't investigate or consider changes beyond behavior, changes in our very essence or understanding of our very essence. And to me, that's a difficulty. To me, that's somewhat of a problem. And I think that's a problem that exists with some aspects that focus on mitzvot and so forth. And I want to be very careful how I phrase this, because in Chas v'Shalom they should give any challenge about mitzvot and so forth and so forth. But in certain ways, doing an action of a mitzvah is not that difficult. I'm not saying everything is so forth and so forth, but to say, listen, yesterday, now I'm going to start doing this action or doing that action, they are basically focusing on actions, but the essential person stays the same. And what occurs is that there's a different manifestation of action, and that's often perceived to be a tremendous accomplishment, and it is. On a certain level, it is. Getting a person to not eat treif, getting a person to put on tefillin, getting a person to take a little minestra, getting a person to come to shul, whatever. There's obviously a value in that. But the question is how much do we focus on the change underlying the action? That the change of the personality, or the change of the being, and in a certain way, that's a level of tshuva that is often overlooked, because it's a level of tshuva that goes into the very being of the person and has them struggle with their very being. Let me try and give you an example. Okay? Try and give you an example. Sorry, mic's getting me a little bit here. Let's say let's say a person well, usually it concerns midot and aspects of midot, concepts of personality and so forth, of character traits. Let's say a person is very careful about time, very, very careful about time, and is very what's the word I'm looking for? Very exact with time, right? There's someone who's punctual and so forth and so forth. And then what you encounter is the person having to relate to an individual who's not as punctual, right? It's not simply a behavior thing. The matter that at what point in time, or how does this punctual person learn to live with someone who's not punctual? An employee, an employer. And you can sit there and say, well, I know this person's behavior is not correct, because the person should be punctual. But on the other hand, this person who is not punctual, it's just their personality and so forth. And you're called upon to have to relate to them. And let's say the example is that it's the employee who's punctual and the employer who's not punctual. So the employer basically says to the employee, it's my time. And, you're working for me, and it's my time. And if I'm not punctual, like if I say, okay, I'll meet you at 9:15 and I don't show up till 9:30, and you've lost 15 minutes, well, it was my 15 minutes anyways, right? Because I'm paying you, right? So I'm paying you by the hour and so forth. So, let's not be so harsh about it and so forth. The person gets upset, gets angry, and then there's a challenge of how is this employee going to live with this employer who's not punctual, and challenge about that type of relating. And that's not really just an action. it goes into values, it goes into um, emotions, being upset, not upset, and so forth. But the answer lies in the person having some type of acknowledgement or sensitivity to the the lack of punctuality, for the right word, of the one that who's not punctual. Is that movement of learning to relate to someone on that level, is that a process of Teshuva? And you may wonder, well, what's a Teshuva there? Well, it might be a fact where the person is just trying to learn how to relate with this this value, and how to just relate with people who don't share the same structure, and so forth. And maybe one of our demands when we think about how we get along with others is the fact that we learn how to be somewhat sensitive and tolerant. And maybe that's what we're talking about. And maybe Teshuva is not basically just saying, okay, yesterday the person didn't put on tefillin, the day the person put on tefillin, which is just a focus on action. Maybe it has to go down to the root of how do you live with this kind of value situation and conflict and so forth. Now, obviously, the case with tefillin is very much clear as the case of Teshuva. It's a mitzvah upon tefillin, the person is now doing a mitzvah. And when I'm talking about this case of learning to live with someone who's not punctual or whatever, it's hard to really define the concrete mitzvah there. But there is an aspect of looking at oneself and figuring out how you're going to relate with others, and how you're going to consider that, and so forth. And that's much more of an intense analysis, because it touches your very value structure. It touches who you are. It's something that's built inside you, and you even think it's worthwhile. So what I find when we think in terms of Teshuva, I find that this type of Teshuva situation is a little bit more difficult, in the sense that what I find is that a lot of the Teshuva situation is basically you have values, you have motivations, you have personality, and you're doing action A, now you're doing action B. Like I remember seeing a film clip of a person who, from becoming a chassid, became Rahman al-San, a fundamentalist Muslim. Everyone was shocked about that. He went from a chassid to a fundamentalist Muslim. Oh wow! And yet, if you look at the person's personality, basically, it was just a matter of shifting one function for another function. When the person was this chassid, he was fanatical. He was very very intense about a certain intensity and in terms of behavior and so forth. And then all of a sudden he becomes a fanatical Muslim. And if you see the two individual pictures of the guy when he was a chassid and pictures afterwards when he became a Muslim, you basically see, something? He shifted A for B. But that shift was not so fundamental and so forth, and in terms of, it was fundamental in terms of behavior, in terms of emes, in terms of truth, and so forth and so forth. But the personality was basically the same, right? It was like, to sort of say this in a joking way. The guy was a Yankee fan. Now he's a Red Sox fan. Someone said, "Whoa, how can you shift from the Red Sox to the Yankees? They're enemies and so forth and so forth." Because basically, a fan is a fan. So yesterday he was focused on the Red Sox, today he's focused on the Yankees. Yesterday he was focused on the Yankees, today he's focused on the Red Sox. But still the same type of thing, a fan is a fan. But the question exists, and I find that, by the way, I find that it happens a lot of times in terms of the focus on Teshuva. And there's a lot of focus on the outside, the behavior, and the action. And the basic idea that I just want to focus my personality on the correct actions, which clearly has value. But what a lot of people don't think about is that shift in fundamental concept, that shift in that way of looking at the world. Okay, moving from this type of personality thing to that type of personality thing, where it seems to be that there's a shift that happens. And in many ways those are broad concepts in terms of how we look at the world. So what I find is a lot of times when people are considering Teshuva, they're focusing on the external, on the actions, which has validity, but they don't get right down to the core and understanding what the personality aspect is about. So, and this has a lot to do with recognizing others and so forth. So, in a certain way, what I further find is that when people look in terms of Torah, they generally have a way of looking at life, and then they just sort of bring Torah into the way they look at life. But really, they haven't really fundamentally changed. They've changed a lot of actions, but they haven't really changed the fundamental way of looking at life. But in a certain way, what Teshuva is about is a shift in the fundamental way of looking at life. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit, in terms of how we consider life, how we may possibly look at life differently as we contemplate Teshuva in this Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur period of time. Okay, in the Elul and so forth. Let me try and explain what I mean by this. Say you have a person who is, let's say, very patriotic, considers strongly the values of patriotism, and yet when he gets involved in patriotism, okay, he sees certain things happening and certain questions about this analysis and commitment to nationhood and so forth. And then he starts questioning, what exactly is this emotion of patriotism? Why should I consider the value of one nation above another nation? Okay? So the fact is that how often do we do that kind of analysis? See, Alex is asking an interesting question. Okay, what if your perspective is always correct and you don't need to shift it? Can you still do Teshuva? Well, it's an interesting point. Is your perspective already correct? Say, in a certain way, your perspective is correct, then you start moving towards a change in actions and so forth and so forth. But what occurs is that usually if there's really something that needs to be done in terms of improving yourself, we're not all perfect tzaddikim. a lot of times it is looking at your own perspective. Looking right down into looking at your own perspective. And that's the side of Teshuva that a lot of people don't focus on. I'm not saying that there's no need for focusing on behavior. I'm saying that a lot of times we don't correctly consider the focus of perspective. Okay. Let me try and I'm trying to find a good example of this. I have some in my mind, but I don't think they really fulfill what I'm, in this point of what I'm trying to say. Let's say that you think in terms of classical movements of Klal Yisrael. Obviously this is one of the aspects of the Kedes Yitzchak. Okay. Okay. By the way, Alex is asking, isn't perspective itself a matter of perspective, meaning it isn't something objective? You're right. I'm not asking objectively. I'm asking for self-contemplation. The fact that we evaluate, and one of the problems is that we evaluate ourselves. The evaluator is inherently subjective. In many ways, when it looks that we have to look at something, we have an objective standard called Torah, but the fact is as we read Torah and understand Torah, the perspective is that your own subjectivity becomes one of those analysis, one of the factors in your analysis of perspective. And the question is how much you challenge your own subjectivity. You see, let's say I pointed out to people that in many ways a lot of people maintain a certain view of family values that make it seem that Torah basically is in tandem with, let's say, the values of the 1950s. Mother, father, so forth and so forth, all these values. So the fact is that if you look at, let's say, Father Knows Best from the 50s, in many ways it could be almost like a From Family, except for the fact that they're not doing ritual. But the way they are and the way they act and so forth, you can basically say that they are following basically living like From Family, quote unquote, like From Family, and therefore the way to make them Jewish is just by adding certain behavior on. Put a mezuzah on the door, and basically they were already Judaistic in many ways. Put a mezuzah on the door and put a kippah on the man. Wife covers her hair, but basically it's almost the exact same behavior. And in a certain way, that's the way people look at what Teshuva is about. Underlying it's basically we both have the same values, and we're just going to tell you how to live to achieve those values the exact same way. Follow what I'm getting at? So you want this type of family picture? You want a motherhood and apple pie? We're telling you if you do these actions, it will improve this idea of motherhood and apple pie. But the question is that really what Torah is doing? Is that really it? And in a certain way, you get into a question where Torah might be introducing other value considerations. Okay? And it might say, hey, listen, reevaluate this and analyze this. So you look at this situation and say, something? The father should be learning more. So not spending time with the family and learning more. Okay? And that process of learning, it can be very private. Okay? So there's less concept of being at home or whatever. I'll give you an example of this. They say by the Satmar Rav, or Vil Teitelbaum, that he never slept in his bed except on Friday nights. Okay, it was well known that basically he'd have cat naps while he was sitting in the base bedroom, sitting in his office. He'd have cat naps, but he never went to bed. He only because the reason why Alex was asking why, because he was very much involved in learning, very much involved in running his community. He basically was someone who was 24 hours a day was on. He used to have meetings at 6 and so forth. And you read this about all the great leaders. I mean, they say this about Lubavitcher Rebbe. It's no big deal. He'll have meetings at 4 o'clock in the morning or whatever. Okay. The fact is that this story about the Satmar Rav, I've heard from many different cases, and there's a story going that this Gadol, not the Satmar Rav, another Gadol, stayed at this hotel in Florida, and the maid came in and said to him something about, you may be. Asked him something about the previous rabbi who stayed in this room, because she never had to make the bed, right? Did he always make the bed? Never went to bed. Okay. Now the point is what you're talking about is a different lifestyle. You're not just talking about the father knows best situation where the person, oh wow, we're having the family meal here. Oh, now we're going to start wearing kippah. Okay. What you're talking about is a fundamental shift in structure of the family, in lifestyle. And the fact is I'm not saying this is right or wrong. By the way, I'm not giving a judgment. I'm also saying it is very much subjective. This might be right for some Rebbe, might not be right for someone else. There's a lot of different perspectives. But the fact is how often do we think about how much Torah is going to make us reevaluate our perspectives? Okay? Not just reevaluate our actions based upon the way we look at life, but really changing around to the way we act. Okay? Okay, by the way, Alex, you're making a point here. I'm just reading Alex. Alex makes a point. Now, the reason I ask is that this thing about the Satmar Rav is that there's a very popular maze among Jews about the big Torah scholars constantly studying every free second, even though psychologically speaking, it's impossible to study every free second. No one can do that, as any college student learns very quickly. Yeah, the fact is that. First of all, the exception of these type of people is inherently in their personality as well. Okay, and also what you mean by studying every free second. Every free second means free when they don't know other things, but they also have other aspects of life. And it's not. You see. It flows with their personality. The Satmar Rav, the story goes, used to spend an afternoon. He used to have tea with his wife, because there was also an idea that he should spend time with his wife. So he used to have his afternoon tea with his wife. Learning every second doesn't mean totally like robot or whatever. It means that when you're free, rather than just standing around, you have a sefer. Right? It's on your mind. You're thinking about these things. Right? But it doesn't mean you totally are negating any other aspect of existence. It's not the way a lot of people think it is. It flows much more with the personality of the person. But what I'm getting at though is in terms of the ideal, in terms of how we look at what we think Torah is supposed to be accomplishing for us. In so many ways, we have very defined behavior and very defined aspects of how we're supposed to, very, very much in details. What we don't think about is how much we should reconsider certain things, okay, and look at those general ways we look at life in general. Okay, in other words, maybe that the idea of the Torah is to tell us that the way we're looking at life is somewhat different. That there's different priorities, different perceptions of how we're supposed to behave. Okay. By the way, you're Alex, you're pointing to this. This was a famous machlok. Alex, you're pointing to something like this. No, you see, Alex, I brought the Satmar Rav case a little bit different. Alex says this point, but we're not projecting an idealized abstract idea on a human being. Usually I try to avoid stories of tzaddikim because I do not know what I learned from them in these stories. These gedolim don't appear as real people, warts and all, and how can one relate to someone so allegedly perfect? Okay, the fact is this actually was a machlokas about Rav Moshe Feinstein. There was a disagreement about Rav Moshe Feinstein. Some people gave over stories of Rav Moshe Feinstein that put him sort of in a different category. He was like, non-human. He was like a metaphysical saint, right? This story, that story. The Tendlers, his son-in-law Rav Moshe David Tendler, and his grandsons and so forth, his daughter, they were very upset about that portrayal of Rav Moshe. Said Rav Moshe was very much of a human being. He played with his grandchildren. He had relationships. He had a relationship with his wife, and so forth and so forth. So they're very much against that. Okay, and I happen to agree with that viewpoint. What I'm talking about now is not this idea that righteousness is this aspect of a tzidkus that's not human. Okay, and that happens a lot of times. You see, what happens is that people, they hear stories of their gedolim, and they want to say, oh, that makes the person not human, and therefore it's not applicable to me. See, when I read the story, let's say the Satmar Rav that he never slept, now that's not me. Why? Because I need sleep. But the fact of the matter is, and it's not that I want to say, oh wow, that's someone that's totally inapplicable to me. It tells you that he held there was a value in getting as much out of time as you can get. That's a remarkable statement of value. Now, what I think about that is that in my time horizon, I need sleep. Okay? And I can't live the way the Satmar Rav lived. But in my consciousness, I can think about the fact that I cannot waste time. I can't just let it go and say, okay, well, just twiddling my fingers, my thumbs, twiddling my thumbs. The fact is that I want to, given my personality, use my time as best as I can. See, that's a good example of what I mean, in the sense that the perspective of Torah in terms of looking at Teshuva, not looking in terms of specific action, but looking at perspective, is how do you spend your time? And are you careful with your time? Not in terms of this idealized idea of learning every minute, but the point idea is do you know you could better use your time? And how much is it perspective of Judaism that tells you better use your time? Okay? Now, the fact is that that's really what I'm getting at over here. I didn't say the Satmar Rav's story to tell you something about this is the way you should behave. I gave you Satmar Rav's story to say that here was a aspect of behavior, not behavior but of attitude, and that how do I move into that attitude, right? Okay, now the point is, by the way, Alex writes here that doesn't mean to sidetrack the discussion. I don't think you sidetracked it. I think you helped me focus it, because it's something that I find difficult in expressing what I wanted to say. I knew what I wanted to do, but I found it very difficult to express it, because what I find is a lot of people, when they talk in terms of tshuva, people becoming bali tshuva and so forth, there's a focus on action. There's a focus on behavior, and there's no doubt that that's significant. Okay. There's no doubt that they're significant. It's not what they say. Contrary, it's not what they say. It's what others say about them. But the fact is that what I'm getting at is that I'm trying to focus on people. You know, you want to get people. Doing this action and doing that action, and there's a lot of focuses on action and so forth. And what I look at is, okay, but what about that fundamental view of life? And a lot of times I find people becoming interested in Yiddishkeit, and they do more mitzvahs, they do that more mitzvahs and so forth, do a little bit more, a little bit less, but it's all behavior that's tied to the same. It all sort of fits into their attitude about life. And what I'm wondering about is how much do we let Torah, shake up our attitude about life, right? Really shake it up and say, something, we see this and we see people living a very, very different life. And it's not that they live a different life because it's so, things in terms of being this saintly thing, and not in terms of a different life in terms of being totally non-human, but the fact is they're not necessarily following the way most people think. I remember once that there was a Rav my wife worked for many years ago. He's passed away now, and he was an older man. He was working very hard on writing some works. He was always reading and so on and so forth. He told us something that he said to my wife that he never saw more books to be read than on the desk of an 85-year-old man. They think of it. Most people when they're old or whatever, they think, it's time to relax. Florida, I want to take it easy. And the point is that, are we supposed to think that way? Okay, yeah, you have to have rest. But are we supposed to think that life allows us to sort of kick back and rest? Okay, or is it that we are supposed to be pushing ourselves? And how often do we recognize that Torah says, push yourself? Not push yourself to the extreme of hurting yourself, or denying yourself, but the point is that you don't sit back there and just say, okay, I worked already, I don't have to work anymore, and the point is, and then you get into whole new aspects and new levels of work. See, I think that in many ways, I don't buy the concept that Torah is not human. Like, I don't like the stories, as you guys have been talking about presentation of Gedolim as being a what I would call saintly from a non-Jewish perspective. I don't like the perspectives of them not having human drives and human connections. But at the same point in time, I like the idea that there is something, not just in their behavior, but in their consciousness, that's uniquely Jewish. Okay? Not non-human, but uniquely Jewish. And one of them is the fact that in certain ways, the Jew can't rest, right? There's a famous story about the Vilna Gaon. Now, I don't know how much I buy this story in totality, because there's sides to the story that I can't see the Gaon doing it for halachic reasons and so forth. But supposedly the story goes that the Gaon's sister, who lived in another city, wanted to come see him. So she took a train. It was a long train ride, and she came to the door of the Vilna Gaon's house. She knocked on the door, and the Vilna Gaon's shamash came out there and said, "Okay, who are you?" And says, "I'm the Gaon's sister, and I'd like to speak to my brother." So the shamash went in and told the Gaon, "Your sister's here. She'd like to speak to you." So the Gaon said, "Something wrong? Well, what's happening?" And the shamash went back and said, "Listen, the Gaon wants to know what's wrong. What was it?" "Nothing. I just haven't seen my brother in years, so I just want to come see. I just wanted to visit." So the shamash came in and said, and said, "The Gaon, your sister just came. She wanted to visit." So the Gaon said, well, this story goes. The Gaon said, "I'm learning now. There'll be time for us to visit Beilam and Amis. There'll be time for us to visit when after we die and we're in the next world. Then we have time to visit. Now we have time to work, and there's no time for visiting." So he didn't get up to see her. Now I see that story. I have a lot of problems with that story, but this story is told to bring out this idea that the Gaon, looked at every moment extremely carefully to figure it out. Now, the truth is, I think that story is an extreme, but I think there's a concept in Torah that we don't waste time. We try and take as much consideration of time as we can. Now, the fact is that's a matter of developing a consciousness. Okay, that's very different than a lot of other people's consciousness. Because if you look in the general world today, people go golfing, and by the way, a little bit of golf is fine. I'm not trying to challenge that, but there is an attitude of taking off, and I work hard, and I need to relax, and so forth and so forth. And there is truth to that aspect. You need to relax. But the point is what exactly is the ideal, and finding that balance between the two. Now, here comes the real kicker. In a certain way, what Torah does is make you reconsider your whole life, and that's something that people may not truly comprehend. That you're constantly reevaluating yourself with the Torah perspective. It's not just simply about doing this mitzvah or doing that mitzvah. It's constantly challenging yourself. Okay? Okay? Now. Okay? Okay. Now here, Alex writing in, I'm not in any way, God forbid, trying to equate the two. But I have to tell you that there's somewhat similar story told about the founder of the Soviet NKVD, okay? In the post-Soviet world, it was used to demonstrate his unbending, cruel nature. Okay. By the way, Alex, I hear your point. The NKVD, that's the KGB, isn't it? That was before the KGB, wasn't that? Yeah. Okay. So the fact is that that's part of the challenge. So that's part of the challenge of what we're thinking about here. You see, what I'm getting at is that this kind of analysis is the essence of what Torah really is about. It's considering these things, and the fact is that real Rishayim, put in this kind of effort to do rishus, right? In a certain way, Esav and Yaakov were both twins. And in some ways, we weren't able to tell the difference until they were 13. But in certain ways, they had very similar personalities. Just one used that personality to tov, and the other one, Rahman al-Islam, used the personality for bad. Okay? 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 But the point is that what I'm getting at is when you think about Torah, how much is Torah not just telling you about actions, but telling you about your consciousness? and the way you analyze things and thinking about them and then putting them together. Obviously, time's important. You can use time to try and do rishus, or you can use time to, use time to use rishus, or you can use time for good. But the fact is, how much time or how much consideration do we have that Torah is telling you, re-examine your basic structure. As you become frum, if you're someone who's becoming a Baal Teshuva, how much are you changing the very way you look at life? Okay, so that's what I want to talk about now in these few weeks before Rosh Hashanah. Okay, that's really what I want to talk about. I want to talk about how Torah can affect the way you look at life. Okay, and cause you to say that because you are committed to Torah, it's not just simply that your behavior is different, it's that you really think different. You really do. You just inherently you're just different. Okay? 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 And the point is that doesn't mean you don't have relaxation. It doesn't mean you don't have a balancing of things and so forth and so forth. But is there a distinction in the overall vision of life? It's not just simply that you're like Father's knows best and you're serving a kosher meal, but it's the same feelings as that, or is it totally different? It's interesting. I saw this little statement from a rabbi. I think Rabbi Carfunkel. I was just watching a thing on Kosher Tube for a couple minutes, and he was quoting the Rav. I'm not sure the person introduced him. I didn't see who introduced him, but it might have been the Rav. I'm not sure who it was. He says there's a difference between holiday and vacation. Vacation is from vacate. You just want to let everything vacate. You just want to clear your mind. Holiday comes from holy day, trying to make the day holy, which takes more effort. So vacation sort of means you're trying not to do anything, trying to clear your mind. Holiday is you're actually trying to focus on your mind and focus on what you're doing. That's an example of it. And the point is that's an example of how Jews are somewhat different. See, in a certain way, by being Jewish, you take life a little bit more seriously. Torah takes life a little more seriously.